recording going. Okay, guys. Well, welcome. Hopefully you're doing good this evening. It's good to have you on the line with me. In fact, I'll turn on the chat and see how's everybody doing tonight. Hopefully you had a good Valentine's Day, which was on the weekend this year, which was a little different for us. And here we are back for our AT100 automotive course. As far as like what's coming up in the class and what's due, remember what I always recommend you do is to look over at your calendar. So let me see. I'll actually highlight that. Look over here at the course calendar, and we'll open that guy up. And from that, we'll be able to see what's coming up when. So this Friday, like what's due is always running kind of about a week behind of where we're at. So this was related to like safety stuff for like what would be safe stuff you would want inside your garage or shop or a place you were going to work, and our week 2. So we're actually running a couple weeks behind. That gives folks a chance to catch up, so to speak. If if they added the class late, you get busy with work, maybe you're not able to attend these Zoom sessions, gives you a little bit of chance to get stuff wrapped up and get stuff in. Last week we talked all about tools, and we had Sherry Wilcox from Snap-on here talking about the difference between professional tools and consumer grade tools, right? And so you can see that next week your tool stuff will be due, and there's a couple quizzes related to that. And then finally, the week after that is when our safety test is due. And our safety test is a pretty involved deal, so I know that's a big one, and so I wanted to give you guys plenty of time to get that thing done. So that's what's coming up on our schedule as far as what's due, and it's always lagging behind our course lecture a little bit because I want folks to get a chance to hear me talk about it, whether it's live like you guys are doing tonight. Remember, you get your bonus points for being here with me, right? So whether it's being here live, or maybe you have to watch it on YouTube or something later, that gives you a chance to do that before those assignments are due is the idea. Okay, so we always want to jump in here, check stuff out on the calendar. Let me clear all these drawings, and we will go back to our course. The other place to go to, obviously, is to check out your latest class announcements, right? Like, so here I have class session tonight on vehicle inspections. If I click the announcements tab, it loads you up through all the different class announcements and what's going on. So that's a good place to go if you kind of got behind and you want to know, hey, what's going on in this class, right? And then finally, I try to put everything you need for the course in the modules. So here we are. Actually, I can see that my my student profile hadn't completed everything, so it won't let me see all that stuff because I didn't complete the week 1 assignments with my my student profile. So what I'll do here is I'll exit out of my student profile so we can see those modules. Okay, we'll go back to modules here. So week 1 was getting to know your car. Then we started focusing on safety. We transitioned to safety and tools, week 3. And here we are, week 4, vehicle inspections. And we are going to jump through our week 4 presentation. Now, don't forget, if I come down here, I've tried to put in some resources for you. So here's a little overview that explains what's going on this week, right? So we have Leo Gutierrez. He's the shop foreman at Roseville BMW. He was my professor who helped me put together our stuff for this week on the assignment. But I also gave you guys some great links on how to do a car inspection. Here we go, from Axle Addict. Nice little article on how to do a car inspection. If I go back over here to previous here and back to modules. It's thinking about it. There it goes. So we have some things on how to inspect belts, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And of course, what do you got to do? Well, it's under your week 4 assignment. So if you're really on top of stuff and you're getting stuff done ahead of time before it's due, oops, I got a little typo right there. You would do it ahead. Now, originally, why this is week 6, even though we're in week 4, and I forgot to change those to week 4, is because remember, I switched some of the stuff around to move stuff up faster so we could do a module on brakes. And so I know this is week 6. That really should say week 4. So this guy right here, that's Leo Gutierrez. He's one of our adjunct instructors, and he's also the shop foreman at Roseville BMW. He runs you through a couple videos of doing vehicle inspections. Then we have some great video links here on a multi-point inspection, how to test your suspension, all kinds of good stuff there. Okay. When we think of vehicle inspections, this is really our bread and butter in the automotive industry. There's a lot of stuff that you can really diagnose with a good flashlight and to know what you're looking for. And so this is a lot of what we do. A car comes in for an oil change or a basic service, and we look at stuff, we inspect things, and that's how we, identify and diagnose problems, and we recommend repairs on the vehicle. And that's how we not only keep the customer's vehicle in tip-top shape, but that's how we make our money, right, as professionals in the automotive service industry. Of course, obviously, what you don't want to do is be recommending stuff that doesn't really need to be replaced. And this is where shops who are not honest get in trouble if they start recommending a bunch of things that aren't really up for replacement yet. Fear not, if you do a good vehicle inspection, what you'll find is the average car usually has several items that really do need your attention. This is also why when you buy a new car these days, they usually say, okay, well, it comes with free oil changes for the first year or 2 years or something. They want to get you coming back to that dealership for those basic services. And also it allows them to do any warranties, repairs or recalls, and it allows them to do inspections. So if things are not covered under warranty, they can make money off of those repairs as well. Okay, so vehicle inspections is a huge part of the industry and what we do. So to better explain that and for us to kind of do some inspections together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the screen share to my presentation, which kind of follows along with what Leo does in his video clips. But it'll give you a different perspective on it. So remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about this getting to know your car presentation, and we went over like how to figure out the VIN number and stuff. Well, I'm going to fast forward down here, and then we kind of finished up with what are all the dash lights and different things, right? And I stressed, hey, that you can learn a lot of stuff from reviewing the owner's manual, right? And here's the owner's manual tell you is when the scheduled maintenance is, what's due then, right? And actually, if we look at this one, I'm going to change my screen share again and make this a little bit bigger for you guys so it's hopefully easier maybe to see on your screens. So if we look at this, and I can highlight it, if we have a car in, it's at 60,000 miles, yeah, we're going to rotate the tires, but we're going to check fluid levels. We're going to inspect. We're going to replace the fuel filter. Here's another inspect, right? So let me just highlight all the things that are inspection, right? Inspect fluid levels, inspect the engine drive belt, inspect emission control systems. So there's a lot of things that on these different services that are really like inspection things and not necessarily replacement things. I'll change my color here, right? So what would you have to replace? Oh, replace the cabin air filter, right? You might have to do that more often if you're driving it under dusty conditions. We've checked the front and rear diff fluids, CV joints. We rotated the tires, inspected the drive belt, replaced the fuel filter, inspected this. Here we are again, check the axle fluid, rotate tires. If you keep going, it might say change the engine oil, that type of thing. So anyways, a lot of the stuff we do is, you know, all focused around proper vehicle inspection. I cannot stress that enough. So with that, here's our, tonight, we're not going underneath the car so much. We're really going to focus under the hood. So our under hood inspections is where we're at tonight. Okay. So, and you know, if you have a car, and I picked a picture of a car that I'm really familiar with, that's quite frankly very nice to work on for most things. This is a little NA Mazda Miata right here. And you can see a lot of stuff underneath the hood of this vehicle. And we'll come back to this thing, you know, a couple times. We'll come back to this image and look at a couple things. But let me just point out some stuff right now. For instance, yeah, we'll put it in blue here. Here's the dipstick for us to check the oil level on this thing, right? Now, if we're checking our oil level, right, and we pull that stick out of there, and we wipe it off on I like to use like a clean white paper towel. Why do I like to do that? So I can see the color and condition of the oil. But there's going to be a couple lines here, right? The full line and the add line. And of course, I should be somewhere in the middle. And depending upon the engine, that might be a half a quart, get you between the add line and the full line. It might be a full quart of oil makes the difference here. How this dipstick works is it's actually poking into the bottom of the engine. And so if I draw the engine over here, I'm going to draw it as just like a square, okay? And it has its aluminum head on top, but on the bottom, it has an oil pan. So I'm going to draw the oil pan. It's going to go like this, and I'll change my colors. And so here is that dipstick, and he goes down and goes through a tube and actually dips into the oil that's sitting in the pan. So that's why we do this oil level check with the engine off, right? So I'll put off. And you can do it at a couple different times. Like before you start your car in the morning, you could pull that stick off out of there, wipe it, dip it, and you would have a good idea what the oil level is. Or you would want to run the engine and get it hot and then shut it off and then check it then, okay? But the idea is you want to shut off the engine so it all kind of drains back down through the engine back to the bottom of the pan, so that dipstick can go in there and get a good measurement. So in this image, we could see the dipstick pretty readily. We can see here's the master cylinder and the brake fluid right there. Here's our power steering fluid reservoir on this car. Here is our radiator cap, and there's our coolant overflow, and I can see through it, and I can see that this guy's just maybe a little bit above the full line. Here's our windshield wiper fluid. Okay, so, you know, it's pretty easy to check those fluid levels on this engine. This thing probably has a manual transmission. You have to go underneath the car to check that fluid level. One of the things on that schedule, it said check the evap system. Here's your evaporative emission control canister right here on this vehicle. Okay, and yeah, that gets us through the, oh no, here we go. Here is our clutch master cylinder. So this thing is definitely a manual transmission. Spark plug wires. The spark plugs are down in those boots. In the center of the head. Our fuel lines and stuff are coming in right here. Here's our throttle cable. So that, and of course our air filter would be in this plastic box. That meter there is our airflow meter. So there's a lot of stuff I can see underneath the hood of this engine. Here's our PCV valve right here. And this engine is pretty clean. It's pretty tidy, pretty well maintained here. You know, any questions on some of the stuff I pointed out so far? Remember, you can put those in the chat. You could turn your microphone on and just call it out. That would be cool as well. We'll come back to this thing. This thing is pretty clean and tidy, but there is a few things that I noticed that we'll spend some time talking about here in a little bit. All right, we'll clear out those drawings and we'll keep moving, guys. We'll keep going. Now, you don't see this sticker underneath the hood here. I do notice that there is, as far as stickers, there is a sticker here that looks like it's related to belt routing. There is a sticker on the fuse panel here. There is a few stickers on the radiator and its electric fan and the cap. But the underhood label on this particular car is actually stuck on the underside of the hood, okay? Now, we've talked about underhood labels before, and they give you all kinds of great info. They really do. Because on them, you have like some engine ID stuff, like what size is the engine? This engine is a 5.3 liter displacement engine, okay? It'll again tell you the year of the car. It'll tell you what type of regulations, emissions regulations does it meet, okay? It'll tell you what type of diagnostic system. Here we have OBD2 certified. It even tells us a little bit about the emission controls on the vehicle and some of the routing of the vacuum hoses. So there's a lot of info on here that this label can tell you. So if that label's there, I like to use it, unless, let's say, it's a red car like we had here, but the hood's blue or something, like obviously, like you're like, oh, somebody switched the hood on this, then don't trust that label, right? But if it looks legit, it looks like the original hood, you can get a lot of great information off of this label. Okay, we saw this in the other image, but here's another shot of a underhood fuse box. This looks like it's off of a little Ford Ranger here, and this one happens to be sitting right next to the brake master cylinder, and is a little bit more common. Like, you know, this engine's a little dirtier underneath. That's pretty common. Let's take a look at the fuse, underhood fuse relay center. It's this power distribution box there. Notice that a lot of times they'll give you the instructions on how to get into these things. It's printed on the box. It says pull tab to release, and then it lifts up and hinges over on this side, okay? So if we do that, what you can see inside here is you see there is a selection of big fuses. Those are called maxi fuses. There's some micro fuses, if you will, or mini fuses. There is a couple of circuit breakers. There might be a fuse puller. These little boxes here. These are relays. So I have 3 pretty big size relays and 3 smaller relays that probably go to accessories. How do I know what these fuses and stuff go to? Well, oops, you can't see it from this photo, but on that lid that we just flipped over, that is now sitting over here, it's got a little chart that will tell you what the different fuse numbers are. The other place you could look is in the owner's manual, okay? But there'll be a chart to basically decode, okay, this 5 amp fuse goes to the dome light. That 20 amp fuse goes to the tail lights, right? This 15 amp fuse goes to the computer fuel injection. So there'll be some type of decoder on the cover. It might be a sticker on top of the cover. It's usually on the inside of the cover, but it will tell you where stuff is. Now, this is the underhood fuse / relay center. There might be one of these. There could be a couple of these, and there's still likely one underneath your dashboard. Okay, so it's not just what's underneath the hood, guys. There's usually stuff underneath your dashboard as well. Okay. I got some information here on belts. You might have an older vehicle like we have right here, and it's got a bunch of V belts. Now, why do we call them V belts? Well, if we looked at them from the side, they form the shape of a V. And so it grips on this side and it grips on that side. It's not really gripping on the bottom. This is where the grab is between the belt and the pulleys. So older cars that used V belts, if you had more accessories on them, an alternator, water pump, then you got that would be one belt, alternator, water pump, but then maybe you got a power steering pump. Maybe you had air conditioning. Maybe you had an air injection pump for emissions. Well, what you would end up with then, guys, is a whole bunch of different belts. So here is a good example of that. I have this is my water pump here in the middle, and we call it a water pump, but it's really pumping the coolant through the engine, right? So it's going around the crankshaft and over here to the alternator, okay? Here's my power steering pump, so he's got a separate belt. And I would say my air conditioning, he's going over that way. So this thing has 3 different belts on there, right? And of course, if I want to get to the alternator belt, that means I have to take off the other 2. So it makes sense if you're going to change belts, change all these belts, so that, you know, they're all fresh on side there, right? Now, things like belts and hoses, of course, these things are made out of rubber and they don't last forever, right? They don't last forever. So we got to change those on a pretty regular basis. So usually every 4 to 6 years, you want to change out a lot of those rubber components like belts and hoses. Even if there's not a lot of miles, because stuff starts getting old and it's much more likely to start leaking. What I do to test things like hoses is I'll squeeze a hose right here where it bends and right there, because where the coolant that's pumping through there has to make these bends, that's where it usually starts a vortex and starts eating up the inside of the hose. So if I squeeze the hose here and then I squeeze it right there and it's softer right there, I know the hose is deteriorating on the inside, and that's going to cause a failure. And I've had that cause a failure even on my own vehicles. Okay. So V belts, check them. You know, look on the back sides, you know, for little cracks and stuff in there. You know, I always like to mix in a lot of tech tips, right? So what if I have a loose belt? Oops. What would that sound like, a loose belt? You guys tell me. Who's heard a loose belt before? Anybody out there? What do you guys think? Loose belt. Have you heard of that before? Jacob or Caitlin, Rebecca, you guys ever, heard a car make a belt noise?
The screaming lady, right?
Screaming lady. Yeah. So if you hear a car, a lot of times it's like when you first start a car and it sounds like the tires are burning out, like you're going and you're burning tires, but the car's sitting there in a parking lot or in the driveway. And so, it's not burning tires. It's not going anywhere. Right. But it kind of sounds like it's burning out. That's loose belts or worn belts. Right. And as they wear out, they lose their tension. And basically, if these belts are slipping on the pulleys, right, they're rubber belts and they're slipping on metal pulleys, it'll make noise like that. It'll make that noise like you're burning out essentially, except you're not burning out rubber tires on the pavement, you're burning out rubber belts on your pulleys. Okay, so that loose belt noise, real common is it's just starting to get loose to do it on like a cold start in the morning. Why? Because everything's cold, stuff's a little damp, the belt, it's not warmed up, the rubber's not grabby yet, and you start it up when the engine's cold. Of course, the alternator, this guy right here, this is the alternator, and his job is to charge the battery. So as you're cranking over the engine, power's coming out of the battery. As soon as you start the car, this guy goes, hey man, I need to charge that battery back up. So he takes horsepower from the engine, makes magnetism on the inside and generates electricity, charges the battery back up. So all of a sudden he's hard to turn because he's trying to charge up a battery. And what you end up with is the perfect recipe to have some belt slippage. Now, as the belt starts to slip, it starts to heat up the rubber, and then a lot of times the slip goes away. So you'll hear somebody, they'll start their car, it'll make that squealy noise that happens for maybe 5 seconds to maybe 30 seconds. And then after a while, it might go away because now the belt slipped so much, it heated up all the rubber on the pulleys, and now it's grabbing better, and the slippage noise went away. Okay, that was real common in the days of V-belts, but can still happen with modern belts as well. Okay, so a more modern vehicle would have a serpentine belt. Now, why do we call it a serpentine belt? Because that belt, he snakes around. He's going down here to the power steering pump, and he's going around the crankshaft and over here around something else. And then he's going back around to the water pump, and here's an idler pulley, and here's my alternator right here. So because the one belt snakes all around, and so that's where we get the name serpentine, and because the one belt, you're like, well, how can it do all that? Well, this one belt, the serpentine belt, is a multi-groove V-ribbed belt. So he has a lot of actual surface area on him. And we use this side, but we also use the back side as well. What you end up with is you don't need, 3 different V-belts or 4 different V-belts. We can get the job done with one belt. But of course, if this belt breaks, then everything's done, right? The critical thing is if the belt breaks and now you're not spinning the water pump, you're not going to be moving any coolant through the engine, and it's going to overheat extremely fast. So that is something to watch. Now, there's no sensor. Well, there's maybe a temperature sensor, temperature gauge in the car. But let me go back to some of these pictures, right? That belt's turning the water pump, but it's connected to the alternator, which charges the battery. Again, we're connected to the alternator, right? If your belt were to break, okay, and I go back to the lights on my dashboard, remember, I don't know if you guys remember or not, but we talked about how this little light that looks like a battery, it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, the battery's bad. What it means is the alternator or charging system is not charging the battery. So if you're driving down the road and all of a sudden this light comes on, the alternator could have failed, the battery could be defective, but the other thing that could have happened is maybe the belt broke. And if the belt broke, now the alternator is not spinning, and so the light has turned on. Especially if, like on a serpentine belt, it's also turning power steering, so maybe your steering gets real stiff, hard to turn. And so what would you want to do? You would want to try to get over to the side of the road as quickly as possible, get that car pulled over into a safe spot as quickly as you can, and then shut that baby down so you don't overheat the engine. And then, when it's safe to do so, hop out, pop the hood, and see what you got going on, okay? Because if the belt breaks, you're likely going to see that battery light or charge light come on. Okay, so we talked about V belts and serpentine belts. Well, what about a timing belt? The timing belt, if I go back a couple slides, you can see it's got like cogged teeth in it, right? And in the description, it says, okay, well, this type of belt will synchronize the movement of internal engine parts, namely the camshaft with the crankshaft, okay? And if this belt breaks, the engine's not going to run anymore. In fact, if this belt breaks, depending upon the engine, it can do significant damage to the engine. Okay, so here is the covers off on a car. This is a Ford 2.3 liter little 4-cylinder. This is basically the same motor that they put in Ford Pintos way back when in the 1970s. And what you have here, I know it's hard to see maybe. I just saw the chat here. Caitlin says, I heard a temporary fix on belt squeal is deodorant, but it could be a joke. No, that might work. They make all kind of like belt treatment stuff. I've heard people putting hairspray on there. It's going to make the belt grabby. Obviously, any type of stuff, like if you had a squeaky belt, anything you spray on there and makes the noise go away, that's always going to be a temporary fix at best, right? A lot of times what I would do to find, well, which belt's noisy, I just spray them with water. The water would make the noise go away as far as slippage noise, and I know which belt was bad, and then I'd replace them. If you're always having to spray hairspray or belt dressing on there, obviously it's going to make a big mess. Those types of lubes actually deteriorate the rubber even more. So that would be a temporary fix, right? We don't want to try to fix stuff with just spraying it with a can of crud. We want to fix those, replace those belts, and make sure that they're properly tensioned. All right, this belt is a timing belt. And so what this belt does is it's underneath plastic covers. You normally can't see it. Down here is the crankshaft that spins at the bottom of my engine. Up here is the camshaft. And this thing has to be perfectly timed. The camshaft has to be perfectly timed to the crankshaft. Well, this guy's, 2-3 feet away from that guy. So this belt is a way for us to keep these two guys connected together and moving in unison. And it makes for a nice drive mechanism that doesn't need to be oiled or anything, that runs quietly. The downside with the timing belt is if this belt breaks, we can have valves hitting pistons and severe engine damage. So these belts had recommended change intervals because you couldn't just see them by popping the hood. Like I said, it took, at least 30 minutes of work to get to this point so we could take the covers off and look at the belts, the timing belt on this. So what you would do is you'd look in the owner's manual or in your service manual, and it might say, hey, every 60,000, so I'm going to put 60K for 1,000 miles, replace the timing belt. Or it might say every 80,000 or 90,000. Usually 90 was the longest you could go. You would replace this belt, okay? And this was a job where you had to, do all the stuff just perfect because this had to be perfectly timed from the camshaft to the crankshaft. And if you did it wrong, putting the belt on wrong could cause stuff to fail and cause a big problem. So mechanical engine damage. Anyways, so that's what a timing belt is. timing belts were really popular on cars starting in the 70s, but really in like the 80s and throughout the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, as manufacturers looked to make their cars even, require even less maintenance, a lot of them got rid of their timing belts and replaced this timing belt with a timing chain that in theory lasts the life of the engine. They don't always necessarily do that, but that was the theory. I want to point out a couple other things while I got this image up, okay? Because remember, you can see a lot of stuff by just looking around and having a nice flashlight. So I'm looking at this image, and what you'll notice is this car uses a serpentine belt. There's the pulleys on there with all the little grooves in them for that little serpentine or multi-V belt. Whenever I take my serpentine belt off, which I had to do at this point to get to the timing belt, I would spin all these pulleys with my hand to make sure that they all were easy to spin and they sounded nice. If any of these were hard to turn or they sounded raspy, when I spun them by hand, I would replace those items, okay? Because the bearings on the inside are starting to go bad, whether it's an idler, the AC compressor, the alternator, stuff like that. When I change it, look at a timing belt, I like to replace that idler so it doesn't fail on me. The other thing I want to point out is this neck right here. This is the water pump. We've taken the pulley off. Notice that there's a little hole right here. That hole looks a little rusty. What you can't see from the image is on the bottom of this thing, there's another little hole on the bottom. Those holes are called the weep hole. And a lot of times when the seals inside the water pump, when those seals fail, what will happen is coolant will leak out of the weep hole, okay? And it leaks out of the weep hole. A lot of times it leaks out and it dribbles down the lower radiator hose and drips on the ground. And you look at that and you go, oh man, my lower radiator hose is leaking. Get like a good flashlight, get one of those inspection mirrors that you can telescope out and position all around. It's probably coming out of the weep hole on the bottom side of your water pump. That's really, really common as the water pumps get old. All right, let me check out the chat. Which is better for a car? A timing chain or a belt, Rebecca asks. Well, that's a good question. I would say each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Timing belts, we know we had to change those maybe at every 60,000 to 90,000 miles. Okay. And if we didn't, the belt most certainly would break and we would have major, major problems. Right. But they were relatively simple. They didn't require them to be lubricated or anything. They didn't require special tensioners. The downside is if they broke, it could be major, major engine damage, right? And what you had is a car that every 60,000 miles or every 80,000 would need like a major service. And that major service would cost the customer anywhere from maybe $500 to $1,200, like depending on how many hours of labor it took to change that belt, right? So it was a pretty big service point. From a mechanic's perspective, that was a good job. Like that was a good moneymaker. That was a job that took a reasonable level of skill. So it wasn't like your entry level tech. You didn't necessarily need to be a master tech, but somewhere like a mid-level journeyman tech. And a lot of times if that job, it might pay 4 hours or something to do a timing belt. And if you were really good, maybe you could do that job in 2 hours. And so you would get paid for 4 hours and you only work 2 hours. I mean, that was a way you can make some good money. From the customer's perspective, it's probably cheaper to have a car with the timing chain. However, what I see is that in theory, timing chains last the life of the engine. In all actuality, they really don't. And so what we see is cars with, maybe 120,000 miles to 150,000 miles. The metal chains, which almost look like a bicycle chain on steroids. There's all kinds of plastic chain guides and an auto tensioner, and some of these guides and things will fail. and then we'll have like a catastrophic failure that's really expensive to fix, and it usually happens outside of warranty. And some cars are more prone for issues than others. Some cars, man, that timing chain lasts 200,000 miles. But other cars, it doesn't, and the chains start slapping around and making noise. And so it kind of depends. If your goal is just to get the car through warranty and then you're going to trade it in and get something else, chain's a better way to go. However, there's nothing wrong with the timing belt really, as long as it gets changed on a regular basis and the person doing the job does it correctly. Okay. A timing belt job is definitely not a job that we would normally do in AT100. Okay, so then Caitlin's asking, hey, what aren't the belt chains inside the engine? Yeah, so see how this is kind of on the outside, it's underneath some plastic covers. An engine with a timing chain, the metal covers have to cover all this stuff because it all has to be lubricated, right? That chain has to be lubricated. So it has engine oil, like oilers splashing over it. And it bottom line is it makes the car more expensive to produce with the timing chain, but it takes away that major service job. And so from a warranties perspective, it's probably better for the manufacturer. But yeah, it's kind of more, it's still at the on one side of the engine or the other, usually on the front of the engine. But it's going to be inside the metal covers with the timing chain. Okay. Good questions, everybody. Good questions. Okay. So getting back to maybe some more basic stuff, our engine oil, right? Checking that oil level. We already talked about, either do it like first thing in the morning or start your car and run it a while so the oil flows through the whole engine, kind of warms up, then shut it off, take the stick out, wipe it on a white towel wide so that you can look at the color of the oil, right? On that white paper towel or whatever, it'll give you a good view of, well, how dark is this oil, right? And put it back in there. There's different viscosities or thicknesses of our oil. So on this particular car, this is a Buick here, Buick 3.8 liter, it tells us, hey, use 10W30. Now the W actually stands for winter, not weight, which is kind of confusing. But what it means is the oil will behave as a 10 weight oil would when it's super cold. And when it heats up, it's going to behave as a 30 weight oil would when a 30 weight oil is at approximately 200 degrees. Okay. And that gives it a more uniform viscosity over the temperature range that the oil will see as it runs in the engine. So we can see if we go to really cold climates, 18 degrees, below, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 18C, they say, hey, you should probably go down to a 520 viscosity. But if I'm in hotter climates, I could go 1030, 1040. So anyways, it tells us a little bit about what thickness of oil should we use. They also recommend an energy conserving oil, and they give us an API rating, which is related to like the quality of the oil, like minimum standard oil quality there. So API, by the way, stands for American Petroleum Institute. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. So the big thing is knowing what weight or viscosity, think of that thickness, right? So something like, I don't know, something like honey is very viscous. It pours out real thick versus water is super thin, right? So what viscosity do you want in your engine? Okay, so here we have all kinds of oils and at our same brand of oil, different viscosities from a 520 all the way to a 2050. One thing I'll point out to you guys is that what you'll notice is that there is a yellow starburst symbol on these three bottles. What that means is that those three bottles of oil, the viscosity that they're using will work in most engines that are rolling around today. Notice on the thicker weights, the 1040, the 2050, these are more viscous oil, right? They're thicker, like more like honey. They don't have the starburst symbol that says, hey, it'll work on the majority of vehicles, because this would be for maybe racing or heavy duty or old worn out engines. You might want to run a thicker oil, you're running in really hot weather, like 2050. I mean, that's pretty thick oil. If I put 2050 in my modern engine, I could cause all types of engine damage because the oil just couldn't flow to where it needed to go quickly enough. In fact, I've had cars set trouble codes and turn on the check engine light because you put in the wrong viscosity of oil. In fact, I've even had cars, I had a Toyota Prius, the thing wouldn't even start. The master warning light came on. We call that the triangle of death because it comes on like this. Boom. Car tries to start, that comes on, done. Because do it yourself for a second. I'm going to change the oil on this thing, and they put in the wrong viscosity. Okay. And to show you how advanced a car like that Prius is, and I'm talking a 2004 Prius, like a Gen 2, like, this is an old car now by modern standards, right? The thicker oil made the engine harder to crank over. When the motor generator went to crank over that engine, it's like, oh, I'm pulling too much power through my electrical circuits to try to crank over this engine. Something's wrong. Uh-oh. Set some codes, triangle of death, and I'm not going to let it try to start again because I don't want to damage any of the electrics of the car. So all from changing the oil and putting the wrong oil in there. So the viscosity of the oil is important, especially on modern cars. Now, let's say you have some old 1965 farm truck that's barely running with a zillion miles on it, then maybe I want to run some 1040 or 2050 in there just to try to keep that thing running. And the engine's so loose and worn out on the inside, it likes that thicker oil. Okay. But for modern engines, that's not what we want to run in our engine. Okay. So the viscosity is a big deal. What about, here we have conventional oil versus synthetic oil. What's the deal with that, guys? What do you guys think? Conventional versus synthetic. What do you guys run on in your cars? You know, even if you're not changing your own oil, you probably have had your oil changed somewhere, or you're with somebody and they've had their oil changed. Do they run conventional, synthetic? Maybe you've seen the synthetic oil commercials on TV. What do you guys think? 530 synthetics, Mobil 1. You know what, Caitlin? Boy, I'm really starting to like you. It's hard to go wrong with Mobil 1. In fact, Mobil 1, when we started the whole synthetic oil thing in the 90s, Mobil 1's always kind of been like the standard of synthetic oils. Like everybody tests their product against Mobil 1. It's like the baseline. So it's hard to find too much fault with it. There might be better ones out there. In fact, I would argue that there probably are. This is darn good oil. Now you notice that here I have a 530. This would work on most engines. It's got the starburst symbol. We got a 1550. That's more like a racing type oil that you might run. Okay, again, 1030 starburst symbol. So you get the idea how those two things come together. Synthetic oil means that it's essentially man-made, where conventional oil, if I go back the slide, conventional oil is refined from oil pumping out of the ground, right? Like my Texas oil plant, I pumped it out of the ground. It's basically, it's dead dinosaur bones in the ground, right? We pumped it out of there. We send it through the refinery. We pull out different things. We pull out lighter compounds like gasoline and diesel fuel. And as we kind of come down that spectrum, we end up with engine oils that then we can further refine and put additives in. But this is pumped out of the ground. This is man-made, okay? What's the advantage of that? Well, synthetic oil will usually give you an oil that can go up to higher temperatures. So when we think about oil, usually when oil gets to 250 degrees, it's getting pretty darn hot. And I'm going to say degrees Fahrenheit scale. It's getting pretty darn hot, and it's going to start breaking down. Synthetic oil usually is safe to go up to about 300 degrees, sometimes more. So it does better on the real high temperatures. Okay. It also does better on the real low temperatures. It will say more liquid even at extreme cold temperatures. So it's better over a wider temperature range. So if you were going to really run your engine hard and get it super hot, or you're going to run it in super cold weather, synthetic oil would do better. I will say that because it has and it all comes down to the molecular structure. It's like the molecules inside the oil are all the same size type of thing. I will say if you have an engine that leaks a little bit of oil on the ground, you start running synthetic, you're going to find that it's leaking a little bit more oil on the ground, because I'll tell you, it leaks out of there a little bit easier because it has that better low temperature performance. So anyways, by all intents and purposes, synthetic oil is a better product. It has a better base stock. But I don't necessarily want to just put synthetic oil in my car and never change it. And I see people do that. They think, oh, I got synthetic oil, I can go 20,000, never change it. Well, the oil is still going to get dirty inside the engine. So even if the oil is okay, if it's all dirty and cruddy, I really don't want it flowing around my engine. So anyways, yeah, so Mobile Ones is the standard. I'm looking through the chat, talking about Royal Purple. Royal Purple is good stuff. I'll tell you, like, Royal Purple is an oil that it doesn't tick in the lash adjusters of my Miata until it gets super hot. So Royal Purple is a pretty good oil, and it's cool because it's purple, right? But no, it's a good oil. The one thing I don't like about it is it's hard to judge how dirty is Royal Purple, because when you put it on that white cloth, that white paper towel, it's always going to look kind of dark because it's purple, right? It does get darker, but it's much harder to judge the condition of the oil based off its color with Royal Purple, because it's basically got some purple dye in the additive package. But it is generally pretty good stuff. So keep track of your mileage. If you were going to change your oil every 3,000 miles, you could probably push that to 5,000 miles or more with Royal Purple, a good synthetic oil. I still like to change that oil because that will help me remove contaminants from the engine. Okay. So speaking about oil, when you're doing an underhood inspection, look around for signs of oil leaks. If you see wetness, and what will happen is the dirt will stick to the wetness of the oil leak, like you see here in this screen, that's a sign, hey, I got a leak there, okay? So what is this here? This is a money-making job right here. This is, maybe another couple $100 in your wallet if you take care of this valve cover replacement. And, this might be a car where if I'm going to change this valve cover, I should also do a valve adjustment on it and to take care of it properly. So that could be a good little service job on the car. I could change out the crankcase ventilation valve right there while I'm at it. What happens if you don't? If you're like, I won't worry about it. Well, eventually this oil will continue to seep out. It'll get on these spark plug wires and start to deteriorate the rubber insulation of the spark plug wires. And then that can cause a misfire. Now the car is running really poorly. Then it starts burning up the catalytic converter, and just bad things can continue to happen from there. If an oil leak got excessive and then the oil level got too low on the engine, it could ruin the engine, right? So, I definitely, I like to try to stay on charge of oil leaks if I can. This one's just kind of seeping. it's making a mess, it definitely would be something I would recommend replacing, fixing that leak. And I would look up in the manual to see, well, does this car need a valve adjustment, or is there anything else I can do while I'm there doing this particular job, right? Because it just makes sense for the customer, if you're in there doing one job, to get that other stuff done as well. So, with transmissions, some of us get the joy of driving a manual transmission, but I'll tell you what, most cars these days are automatic transmissions. Like, unless it's a sports car or something, it's probably going to have a automatic transmission. And if I have an automatic transmission, it'll usually have red transmission fluid in there, and I need to check it. Now, there are some new cars that they don't have a transmission fluid dipstick, but for a long time, if you had an automatic transmission, you had a dipstick here to check, and you'd check it differently. So the engine oil, you check that with the engine off. But what about an automatic transmission? You guys tell me, do I check that with the engine on, or do I check it with the engine off? What do you think? What do you guys think? Engine on or off? It's a little bit of a tricky one. All right. Well, I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Most all automatics, and I always say most because there's always some weird exception to the rule, but almost all automatics, I check this with the engine on or running. Why? Because when the engine's running, it's spinning a pump inside the automatic transmission, and that's pumping the fluid to all the places the fluid needs to go. And that's when I can get an accurate check. In fact, if I looked up the procedure for this particular vehicle right here, the manual would say, hey, start up the car, let it warm up, go drive it around. And what you're doing by driving it around is you're warming up the transmission fluid. The transmission fluid is actually going to expand a little bit as it heats up. And it will say, hey, make sure it shifts through all the gears. First, second, third, fourth, or overdrive, put it in reverse, make sure you shift it through all the gears. And once the transmission fluid is hot, now I'm going to, with the engine running, pull this dipstick out, wipe it with my white paper towel again so I can look at the color. It's usually a red color. It shouldn't look black or anything. It shouldn't smell real terrible either. That's another thing. Not only do you look at the color, whether it's your engine oil, your transmission fluid, you always smell the fluids. If they smell burned, that's a bad sign. Okay. If it's like on the engine oil, if it smells like gas real bad, that means my oil is fuel contaminated and it should be changed. Right. So anyways, I look at it, I put the dipstick back down the tube, I pull it back out, and I look at that level. And again, there's going to be some type of full line, and there's going to be some type of add line. And like the engine oil, perhaps even more critical though, I want to be, somewhere between these two lines. I don't want to be too low. I also don't want to have my fluid level. I don't want that fluid to be above the full line, because that can cause the fluid to be foamed up and stuff in there. And that inside this transmission, there's, it's really a bad looking, but there's gears in here. And the gear is supposed to be a gear. And these gears are spinning around. And if the fluid level's too high, they start spinning up the fluid and they start foaming the fluid. If the fluid gets all foamed up, all right, Caitlin, we'll see you next time. Yeah, I know we have our other classes starting too. So anyways, if you overfill the automatic transmission, you can end up burning it up, just like if it was too low. So with automatic transmission fluids, but even with engines, you really don't want them filled above that full line, okay? So you want it kind of right in the middle, maybe close to the full line, but I really don't want it above the full line. If that's my full line right there, I would want my fluid level just like where I drew this red line right here, where it's close to it, it's not exceeding it, okay? All right. So that is how you check your automatic transmission fluid. Now you can see that it's a little bit more tricky doing that, right? So why does this slide say, hey, buddy, not all automatic transmissions use a service dipstick? Because so many people screw this up and overfill the transmission and burn it up, or they put the wrong type of fluid in their transmission and burn it up. That the manufacturer said, you know what, we got to just keep people out of these transmissions, so they quit messing them up. And so a lot of newer cars starting in the 2000s don't have an automatic transmission dipstick for you to check, because they have found that, you know what, there's less problems if we keep the owners of the vehicles out of those things, because they can't handle the procedure and do it correctly. Because on modern cars, it might say that I have to attach my special factory tool, which is usually like you bolt on a little special dipstick. And then they'll say, hey, take your scan tool, talk to the computer, talk to the transmission control computer, and drive the car and make sure the transmission fluid level, fluid temperature gets up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and then check the fluid level. Like, they'll be very, very precise on what the transmission temperature they want when you check the fluid level. And then they're very, very particular on what fluid that you use, because automatic transmissions these days, there's dozens of different types of automatic transmissions from different manufacturers. And guess what? Seems like every darn one of them uses a different type of special fluid. So here I have 4 types. It used to be way back in the day, like when I first started working on cars, you had your Dextron Mercon, you had this type. This was number 1. This was in most all cars. And then you had your Type F, which was for old Fords. And that was it. Everybody used this one, except for old Fords, used that one, and that kept it simple. And then guess what? Chrysler came out with their own fluid. Honda came out with their own fluid. I mean, everybody's got their own stupid fluid these days. The fluids aren't always red. Some are green, some are blue. Like, it's crazy. You really have to be precise on making sure you're putting in exactly the right fluid that it says in the owner's manual. If you don't put the right fluid in an automatic transmission, you will burn up that transmission. I've had students do it at the college multiple times. I even had one young lady in my class. She went to Made Toyota to get the right fluid, and they sold her the wrong fluid, and she put it in there. And it wasn't until she put it in there that, she had got it pretty much done. And then I saw, oh, wait, that's what you put in there? That's the wrong fluid. But by this point, it was a night class. It was like 9:45 at night. We didn't have any of the right fluid. And it was like, okay, well, try to drive it real easy home and get the right fluid tomorrow. So she went back to the dealer. They gave her the right fluid, but even that short bit of driving, it ended up where a couple semesters later, her transmission did end up failing. And I always suspected it was because for that period of time, she was running the wrong fluid in there. And it really affects the transmissions, because what's weird, the fluid doesn't just lubricate the transmission like fluid lubricates the engine. The engine oil lubricates the engine. The automatic transmission fluid is used as like a hydraulic medium to apply clutches, to engage the gears. Okay. So the different fluids can actually make the gears engage softer or harder, right? Or anything in between. So you put the wrong fluid in there, the viscosity is different, the friction modifiers are different, and all of a sudden now you're burning up the transmission. Okay. It used to be like back in the day, I might take my old Chevy throw a couple quarts of Type F in there, the Ford fluid, because it was a little bit thinner, and it'd make the transmission apply the gears a little harder, and I felt like I had a little firmer shift, right? You know, these days you got to be really exact on the fluids. Okay, I just can't stress it enough. I never want to see any of my students burn up, you know, their transmission as they're trying to service it and take care of it. Okay, batteries. Hey, you don't want your battery to look like that. That is ugly. Okay, that is likely to cause a no start, no crank situation. If it's not doing it already, it will do it soon. Okay, when you go to start your engine in the morning, that's when it takes the most amount of power from your battery, and any resistance from these terminals at all will really mess us up. So this car, at the very least, I want to clean the battery top. I want to put some baking soda and water. You can make it like mix the two together, make it almost like a toothpaste slurry, slather it on there. It'll start eating up some of that acid. Get this all wiped down. Then once you get most of the corrosion off the outside, take it apart, scrub it with wire brushes, get it all cleaned up, coat it with some Vaseline or some battery terminal protective spray. Put it all together, maybe put the little felt pads underneath, like I could see the remnants of a felt pad right there. But keep those terminals clean and serviced. I mean, that's part of normal battery service and maintenance. And you'll end up with a battery that lasts longer and less electrical problems on your vehicle. Okay. I do like how this battery has a nice firm hold down. All the time I see people rolling around, they got no hold down of their battery. Their terminals look like this. It's just a recipe for disaster. Okay, so that would be, you know, probably like a 0.5, a half hour. So that'd be a good, you know, $30, $40 job right there to do. Well, actually, at today's labor rates, it'd be more like maybe a $60 or $70 job, maybe. But anyways, keep those batteries taken care of and clean. And again, you'll have a battery that lasts longer and that is more problem-free and that sort of thing. You know, this is an older picture that I took, and you know, a lot of times you can take these caps off the batteries. However, almost all the battery manufacturers these days recommend that you do not take the caps off. Why? Because if you take the cap off and a bunch of junk falls inside the battery, it ruins the battery. Now this battery's done anyways. This is an Interstate. It looks to me like it's been being overcharged. You can see how wet the top of the battery is, and the cells are dry. There should be electrolyte in there. That electrolyte is a mixture of water and sulfuric acid, okay? And it looks like it's been boiled right out of this battery. So I want to check the whole electrical system. Once a battery is boiled dry like this one is, where you don't see electrolyte covering the plates, honestly, it's time to replace that battery, okay? You could put some distilled water in there, but that battery is already damaged at that point. So I might put some distilled water in there if it was my own car and I'm being a cheap skate like I am, knowing that if it, you know, had a dead battery, I could get a jump or I could deal with it. But if it was my customer car, boom, I'd be changing that battery out of there. Okay, and so when you pull the caps off, it should look like that. But again, all manufacturers recommend that you do not pull the caps off, because if you do and any crud falls in the battery, that contamination will ruin that battery anyways. And I've had several students pull the caps off and they didn't properly clean the battery before they pulled the caps off. A bunch of crud got in there, boom, ruined the battery. 2 weeks later, the battery was toast. So most time, if you tell the battery company, oh yeah, I pulled the caps off, they'll be like, no, you just voided your warranty. Sorry, pound sand. All right, so we're kind of wrapping up on all these fluid checks. Brake fluid, okay? Brake fluid is rated by the Department of Transportation, or DOT, okay? The minimum fluid you would want would be .3. A high performance car might use a .4 fluid. You might have a classic car or some unique car where they want a .5, which is a silicon-based fluid. But most production cars are either .3 or .4. The .4 has a higher boiling point. It can stand higher temperatures. So if I was going to be taking my car out to the racetrack or something, I'd want to throw some .4 in there. But if it's just my regular old pickup truck, I'd want to run .3. Now, it says, hey, warning, harmful of skin, eye irritation. Brake fluid will eat your paint like nobody's business. So if you spill brake fluid on the paint of your car, wipe it up immediately because it will eat your paint, okay? Automatic transmission fluid will as well, but it's not nearly as bad as brake fluid. Brake fluid is almost like a paint stripper. It will take that paint off of there, okay? So here's a picture where we have a vehicle. It's got a brake master cylinder and a clutch master cylinder. Guess what? The brake master cylinder uses brake fluid, but it's not like the clutch master cylinder uses clutch fluid. There's no clutch fluid. You could look all day at the auto parts store and not find it, because we also use brake fluid in our hydraulic clutch assemblies. So both of these guys you'd fill them up with your .3 or your .4 type fluid, okay? So they both use brake fluid. Now, brake fluid is special. It is completely different than like engine oil and stuff. In fact, if you ever put engine oil in your brake system, it would ruin all the rubber seals in your brake system because they're made to run with brake fluid. Likewise, if you poured a bunch of brake fluid in your engine, it would ruin all the rubber seals inside your engine, okay? The fluids are different, and the rubber seals and stuff that are in those components, whether it's the braking system or your engine, are not compatible for those fluids. Also, if you're draining your oil, right, we don't want to just be pouring it on the ground. If you're going to take it and recycle it, you got to be very, very careful. Do not let brake fluid and engine oil mix, because if they do, then that fluid, that mixed brake fluid and engine oil, it is no longer recyclable. It's a hazardous waste, and it costs a bunch of money to get rid of it, okay? Keep those two fluids separate. Really, really, really important. Brake fluid is it's a glycol-based compound. It's made to absorb moisture. I'm going to put in here in your tech tips, I want to change my brake fluid. Change that fluid out of there every 2 years. Why? Because it actually absorbs moisture out of the air. And as it absorbs moisture, its boiling point goes down and down and down and down. And that's why you work on a car that's been sitting around, and you start taking apart the brake system, and the brake system's rusted out from the inside. And you think, well, my goodness, how did that happen? Well, that happened because the brake fluid got really moisture saturated, okay? I also don't like buying a huge bottle of brake fluid. Like this one's a 1 gallon. You know, unless you're doing a lot of brake flushes, get rid of that. Like buy the smaller bottles, because once you open up the bottle, it starts absorbing moisture, right? Once you take that little metal seal off the inside of the cap, it'll start sucking moisture out of the air. It'll start lowering its boiling point. So keep your brake fluid fresh, change it out of there every 2 years. You'll have much less braking problems, brake system problems, if you do that. Same thing for your clutch as well. If you happen to have a manual transmission with a hydraulic clutch, of course, we want to fill it to the proper level. We don't want to overfull. We don't want to not enough fluid in there, right? Here I can see my vacuum booster behind the brake master cylinder. When you step on the brake pedal in your car, you're moving a pedal, which is like a lever, and it pushes a piston. It pushes that piston inside. That piston goes inside this guy right here, and he's like a pump. So I push this piston, he pumps this fluid out of that metal line right there, and that's what actually pumps to each wheel on your car and makes the brakes squeeze down and slow the car down, okay? So it is a very important system that we want to take care of on our vehicles. Now, there are some unique ones. Like this is what I actually have on my pickup truck. It uses Hydro Boost. And so this guy I'm going to circle in red. This is my brake master cylinder. It has brake fluid in the reservoir. I step on the brake pedal. I move a piston. It moves brake fluid down these lines. Okay, well, what's going on the other side? Well, instead of having a vacuum booster, it has this Hydro Boost thing, which takes power steering fluid from the power steering pump and uses that power steering pump fluid to move a bigger piston here that's ultimately connected to your pedal to make it easier for you to step on the brakes. Okay, it's a Hydro Boost. We're using hydrodynamic boosting from our power steering on that. And GM used it on a number of their models. I actually have it on my pickup truck and my Suburban. It's a little different. It works, I guess. So, all right, wrapping this thing up. Coolants. Well, remember I said like everybody got crazy with the automatic transmission fluids, and everybody had their own special transmission fluid. Coolants got the same way in the 1990s. For years and years, you had the green stuff, which is an ethylene glycol based. Everybody had the green stuff. And then, you know what? Toyota came along in the 80s and they said, we're going to run some red stuff. Okay, so I had the green and red. But then stuff started changing in the 90s. So GM came out with Dexcool, and Dexcool's kind of an orange colored. Okay. And then Nissan started using some pink stuff. And then Toyota said, hey, we like that pink stuff. They came up with their own type of super long life coolant that now was pink. So the new Toyotas will have pink coolant. And then Ford said, okay, well, we're going yellow, kind of like your Presto in yellow. And then Honda, BMW, they have some blue coolants out there. It's just an array of colors. I'll tell you what happens if you start mixing and matching, you end up with a lot of problems. So classic one is GM vehicles. They're using the Dexcool and somebody goes, uh-oh, and they poured the green coolant in there. And of course, yellow and green make brown. It would turn into like brown mud and just really ruin the whole cooling system. The same thing would happen with a lot of the other ones. They've come out with some new coolants that will mix with a lot of these different ones. A lot of those coolants are clear or they're a very, very light yellow. And they might mix with, you know, the Toyota or the Nissan or the Ford. Anyways, coolants are crazy. Read your owner's manual. Make sure you're running the right product for your car. Now, what is coolant? Coolant for our climate happens to be a 50-50 mix. So it's 50% or 50% of the ethylene glycol, basically the stuff out of the jug. And it's the other 50% distilled water, H2O, really, really clean water. Okay, we used to run tap water back in the day, but these days we want to make sure we're running water that is really, really pure. So we typically run distilled water. So it's a mixture, 1/2 water, 1/2 of the antifreeze, and that is what coolant is. Well, about, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, the manufacturers realized, hey, you know what? I can sell a bottle of pre-mixed coolant. So it's 1/2 water and 1/2 of the antifreeze. And I'll make sure that then it's really clean water. So you don't have Mutt and Jeff putting, you know, dirty tap water in there and clogging up the cooling system. But also I get to make it like, you know, halfway watered down, and I'll only charge a couple dollars less. So it, you know, makes the companies that produce this stuff more money, I'm sure. Anyways, so a lot of these things are sold today pre-mixed. So you got to look at what you're buying. Is it pre-mixed? or is it full concentration? So I'll grab this one. This is ethylene glycol. And what you'll notice, I want to make sure it's on the camera, is that this says it's, oop, there it is, it's full strength. So I would take this 1 gallon and I would mix it with another gallon of distilled water, and I'd end up with my correct 50-50 mixture. If I happen to live in really, really cold climate, like we're having some really cold weather back at east, if you live where it gets like below 0 and stuff, you might run 60% antifreeze and 40% water, okay? And the racetrack, we're not really racing our cars in extremely cold weather. They actually don't let us run coolant at all. We got to run other additives, because if coolant gets busted out on the racetrack, it's extremely slippery and everybody goes crashing. So anyways, let's clear out those drawings. So coolant, like our transmission fluids and like our engine oils, look at what you have. Make sure you're running the right product. And you'll notice that the coolants that are full strength are, like, you know, quite a bit more expensive than the pre-mix stuff, okay? You know, if I'm flushing out the cooling system in my car, like I've used the water hose and I'm flushing it out, I'm going to run the full strength because it's hard to get all the water out. And so I want to make sure I end up with that 50-50 mixture, right? So sometimes I got to add a little bit more antifreeze because I got to compensate for some of the water that's left over in my engine from doing the cooling system flush. The 50-50 premix stuff is really nice to top off your system and make sure you're not going to mess up those ratios, okay? So I'll buy a little bit of both depending upon what I'm doing. Okay, now cooling system pressure caps have a pressure rating. This one is at 16 pounds. Why do they do that? Every 1 PSI that you raise the pressure increases the boiling point by about 3 degrees. So water by itself, let's just stick with water, not water boils at 212 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. Well, if I put a 10-pound cap, 10 PSI, well, that would give me another 30 degrees of temperature. So now the water inside my cooling system, it wouldn't boil to 242 degrees Fahrenheit. Even more, with this 16-pound cap, it would increase the boiling point even more, right? And then, of course, if I've really mixed it with antifreeze, that actually is going to increase the boiling point of that even a little bit more, okay? One of the things you'll see on these caps, like this one right here, it says, hey, do not remove. Don't take this thing off of here. Well, you can take it off of there, but you better take it off when the engine is cold, because if you take it off when the engine is hot, it's going to blow coolant all over your face. As soon as you take the cap off, the pressure goes away. So now, guess what? My boiling point went back down to 200 degrees. So if I took the cap off of there, boom, it can just start boiling right now and blow all over my face and burn me really, really severely. That's why a lot of these caps say, hey, don't take this thing off of here. You can take it off of there, just don't take it off if the engine's hot. So how do I figure that out? Well, let me get back to this screen share here. And I'll go to that image here. If I can hold my hand on the upper radiator hose here, like if I can hold that hose and that hose is cool to the touch, I can take that cap off of there. There he is, boom. But if I put my hand on that hose and it's like, ooh, that hose is hot. Ooh, I don't want to hold my hand on that hose. Don't take that cap off of there, because you're gonna probably burn yourself and make a big mess. Okay, you could even damage your engine doing that. So, and what do I see all the time? Somebody's driving their car and, oh no, the car is overheating. I can see on the gauge that it shows it's hot, or the the temperature light came on. Oh, this doesn't have a temperature light. It's got a temperature gauge, right? So I look over and oh my goodness, the gauge, it's buried. And they pop the hood and they're like, oh, it's buried. I'm going to rip that cap off of there. Now they just burn themselves and they probably are going to damage their engine because now I've lost all my pressurization. So now instantly, like the coolant starts to boil inside the engine. Okay. It's just, you know, I just made a bad situation even worse. What I'd be better off doing if my temperature gauge is hot, once I see it start creeping up, you know, take the load off the engine, maybe get pulled over to the side of the road, turn your heater on. If you turn your heater on maximum heat, that's like kicking in an extra little radiator that's built in your dash that will help cool down your car. Okay, so turn your heater on full blast. You'll be extremely uncomfortable in the car, but it might just help keep those temperatures within check. Then when you get pulled over to the side of the road, try to get somewhere where there's a garden hose or something like that, and you can run some cool water through the radiator, like over the outside of it to like get the outside of the radiator cool. That should cool the coolant on the inside. Hopefully that will lower the temperature of the engine. You know, it's kind of debatable. You got to kind of gauge it. Well, do I want to keep running the engine so the water pump's pumping the water around? Or do I think that there's no coolant in the engine? So I should just shut it off, right? So if you think there's no coolant in it, shut it off. Like if you see coolant spraying out or leaking all over the ground, just shut it off. But if it seems like it's hot and there's coolant in there and the hose, you feel it, the hose is hot and it's pressurized, I'd be spraying the radiator down with some water to see if I can lower the temperature that way. Okay. So anyways, a couple tips there on what to do if you got an engine that's overheating. So what else have we missed? This, like I said, this is a pretty important one. Let me change my screen share so it's looks a little bit better. So we warned you about that. You know, of course, whenever I'm under the hood, I'm checking all my vacuum hoses and lines and stuff. Here I have a new radiator hose on this one. The thermostat, which controls the temperature of the coolant as it flows through the engine, is located right there. Notice that that guy has a nice screw style clamp. Usually when I change my hoses, I want to put these better kind of worm drive style clamps on there that will give me a more consistent clamping force and pressure on there, which is, that's been done. This one looks like a pretty new upper radiator hose on this one. But I do notice from this image, hey, I got some seepage here. I got some valve cover seepage, right? That would be a good little upsale job to do. So anyways, there's a lot, you know, right here I look at this thing and I go, okay, well, a couple valve covers on a Chevrolet V8, you know, that'd probably be a, you know, well over an hour job. That could be, you know, several $100s of service on that vehicle. All right, power steering. A lot of new cars have what they call EPS. EPS stands for electric power steering. Okay, so a lot of cars, the power steering assist is now electric. But if I have a pickup truck, something that's heavier, or I have an older car, I would likely have power steering that would have a power steering pump that was driven off the engine. And that power steering pump, you know, needed fluid in there. So for most cars, this is the one area where we didn't get totally crazy nuts with the fluids. Most everybody used power steering fluid. And then Honda had their own special stuff. Okay, and that's pretty much how it was. There wasn't too many variances on that. Some cars would use automatic transmission fluid, but most cars it was either this stuff, or if you had a Honda, you used that right there. And we never did get nuts with the power steering fluid because now, like I said, we've gotten rid of that stuff anyways, and we do it electrically. And of course, it makes the system simpler. There's no longer a power steering pump or belts or hoses. It actually made the car cheaper to build and by all intents and purposes, more reliable at the same time. Okay. So you would be hard pressed to find a car these days that had a power steering pump on a new car. Now a truck is different because it's so much heavier. It's hard to have electric power steering on a truck. So you're much more likely to see it on a truck, but not on a car. So there's a couple things I see. So here's my power steering fluid. Of course, don't overfill it because then it will get hot and it'll spill out all over, make a big, huge mess. This usually has a little dipstick built inside the cap that dips into the fluid for you to check the level. And you usually do this fluid check. There might be like cold and hot markings on the stick. As it warms up, it heats up and it moves up the stick. You do this check with the engine off, okay? What I notice on this picture is somebody has put one of these flushing tees with a big old gear drive clamp that's way much the wrong size on this vehicle. It probably had poor cooling system service at some point, and they had to flush it out. I would get rid of this thing. That is a potential leak point right there. I also noticed it's got the factory spring-loaded clamps that, hey, those worked good when the car's new. They have lost their tension now that the car is old. I'd get rid of that. So there's a couple of good things to change there. And quite frankly, that serpentine belt's looking a little rowdy on the backside. So that'd be something else I'd want to change. So you can see when you start looking around, it's pretty easy to find some leaks. This is that same small block Chevy that had the leaky valve covers. Then I look down here and it's like, oh, I got leaky power steering hoses, right? I got a leaky hose right there. So there's another hour or so of labor time. And again, I'm not excited about that. Serpentine belt looks a little long in the tooth. So I'd want to change him as well. So you can see, you can pop the hood on your average car that's 10 years old, and there's, probably $500 worth of service work you could easily do on that car and not be lying about anything. It's all legit stuff that will make that customer happier with their car, and their car will last longer for it, okay? All it takes is a good visual inspection, and for you who is inspecting the car to know what you're looking for. Of course, if you got the car in there for an inspection or you're changing the oil or doing anything else, it's always good to top off that windshield washer fluid. Keep in mind that a lot of this windshield washer fluid that we have in our state now doesn't give you a lot of freeze protection. If you live in really cold climates, it could freeze to the windshield. If you happen to go out to those climates, you would want to change this fluid out of there to get the stuff that really has more alcohol in it, so it doesn't freeze in cold temperatures. And the bottles will be marked accordingly. This stuff in this bottle, this is from Sacramento, so you get below 32 degrees and it wants to start freezing up on you. And so we'll see customers, they go up skiing or stuff. We've put this in their car because that's all we can get down here in the valley at our local auto parts store. And they have problems up in the mountains. So we always tell our customers, hey, if you're going up the hill, get some of that washer fluid from up in the mountains, because it will go to a lower freeze point. All right. So that is just about it. As you can see, just checking all the fluids. Heck, there was a lot of stuff there, right? There was a ton of different things to check underneath the hood of your average vehicle. And what I will do is put the screen on one last time and make it a little bit bigger to see. So if we go back to this one, this is a well-maintained car. Like, I don't see big oil leaks. It's pretty darn clean underneath here. It does look like it has had some cooling system stuff at some point. And I'll tell you why. So I'm a little bit cautious of that. Why do I say that? Well, when I look at this one, let me get my annotation tool back up here. What I'll notice here is that, hey, there's some rusty looking stuff on the bottom there. That was probably rusty water. And I can see some of that rust right along this edge, this seam right here, right? You can kind of see a little bit right there. I notice that this is a little bit over full. So is this thing leaking out a little bit? Radiators, this is your radiator right here, where the aluminum radiator likes to clamp to the plastic tank on the top or on the side for a lot of these. That's where they like to crack and the seal blows out and they start to leak from there. So I'm suspect of this guy having a leaky radiator that's slowly dripping coolant down here. And so I think, I'd be checking the cooling system on this. If nothing else, this is a Miata that's, the newest, this Miata, actually, this has the airflow meter. So the newest this car could be is a 1993, because I know these cars really well. So that means that these hoses and stuff are likely really old. You know why? They didn't change the hose clamps to this style. And that could be a factory hose on that car. And that means that's a potential failure. So anyways, even on a car as clean as this, if you know what you're looking for, there is really some stuff that you should change on that car to keep that in a good state of repair for the customer. So again, vehicle inspections is where we make a lot of our money, because we just fix basic things, but it's those basic things that allow that car to keep working for a long time and keep the customer happy with that vehicle. In the 80s, when we really saw our import manufacturers establish themselves as being better quality than the domestic manufacturers, not only were they better quality, and really, a lot of the cars were better quality, but they also did a much better job of getting their customers to bring those cars back in for service. And if you want to be happy with your car, if you service all the stuff on a regular basis, you're going to have a lot less problems with it, and you're going to be happier with that vehicle. So I hope, that gave you some insights into vehicle inspections. I will switch this back to our Google class, or not Google Classroom, our Canvas class. I apologize. Here we are, week 4, vehicle inspections. That's what we're doing. None of these assignments are due right away, but there's multiple great videos which will kind of add to what I talked about. And then there's, of course, a quiz that corresponds to this, and a little vehicle inspection sheet. And of course, there's a little handout for you as well. I'll go ahead and open up that PDF so you can check that out, of all the different things that you should check on a real inspection. We just focused on underneath the hood, but a real vehicle inspection, like you would do if you're at CarMax or your average dealership, would include all your tail lights, headlights, seat belts, door hinges, all kinds of stuff. Next week, we'll go underneath the car and talk about under vehicle inspections, and we'll get into checking stuffs like your shock absorbers and things like that. So lots of good tech tips. Always make sure you follow your manufacturer's recommendations for engine oil, automatic transmission fluid, brake fluid, and of course your coolant and power steering. Super critical, especially for your coolants and your automatic transmission fluids, but even your engine oils these days. You really got to be on top of that stuff. Do you guys have any questions for me as we wrap up tonight's lecture? I'm sorry that went a little long, but this is a pretty important section. This is the one when you go to do it. I would love for you, if you have access to a car, get a flashlight, get an inspection mirror if you can, and try to do a real inspection on a real car, right? The car's off, do it in a, well-lit area. I would, when you're doing the inspection, take the keys out of the car, put them in your pocket so no one can get in that car and start it up while you got your head underneath there for safety, right? You don't want your hands grabbing the belts as someone jumps in the car to try to start it, okay? I would love for you guys to do a vehicle inspection on a real car, you'll get a whole lot more out of it. If you see something weird underneath the hood of that car, you're like, what? I don't even know what this is or what's going on. Take a picture of it with your cell phone, send it to me. It'll give us something to talk about in class next week, and we'll answer those tech tip things, right? Okay, with that, that'll end our class tonight. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. I really appreciate it. I don't see any questions here in the chat. So yeah, you guys have a great week. Good luck on your assignments. It's still finishing up some safety stuff. Get that safety test done if you haven't done that. I'll start clicking away those grades. I know I'm a little bit behind in grades. I'll get those going for you guys. And again, as always, you get bonus points for being here with me, and I'll get those added onto your totals. So be safe, everybody. Keep learning. Keep having fun, okay? You guys take care.